grinned at life in empty joy, stepped slowly through the lonesome dark and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches cowed and glum, with crumbs and lice and a lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. Machine guns played an important role in World War I, dominating the battlefield as the casualties rose. Early machine guns in 1914 required a gun crew of 4 to 6 and could fire 400 to 600 caliber rounds per minute. However, they often overheated and were rather unreliable. As the war began, the British Army had a much depleted store of machine guns, as they had been rejected and thought to be uncivilised many years earlier. As the war went on, machine guns became more and more important as offensive and defensive weapons. They had evolved into a much meaner killing machine. They were excellent as covering potential enemy attack routes in fixed, strong points, as well as being used on tanks and aircraft. The light machine guns were also invented in 1915, which could be much easily carried in the heat of battle. Overall, the machine gun was a fierce and destructive weapon, playing a major part in such battles as the Somme, where soldiers kept on falling. Machine guns are still widely used today and have helped develop the assault rifle, which is crucial in our army's fight against evil.
Hand-to-hand combat was extremely important in the trenches when up close with the enemy. Soldiers were given training both with and without bayonets, and one such video is shown here. This type of combat was often used in trench raids, with often soldiers valuing knives and grenades over guns, especially for close combat. Apparently, soldiers preferred to use sharpened spades to bayonets while fighting in the trenches, as spades did not get stuck in any opponent when stabbed and were easier to manoeuvre. Many lives were lost in the blood and dirt of the trenches. Hand-to-hand combat showed the war at its most bloody and brutal. When the flamethrower was first introduced by the German army in 1914-15, it brought terror to the Allied armies. However, it was soon used by both. Despite the fear flamethrowers instilled in enemies, they were generally used to clear forward defenders at the start of a German attack. Overall, the Germans launched in excess of 650 flamethrower attacks throughout the war, with the Allied numbers going unrecorded. In 1918, flamethrowers were used on tanks, which continued through World War II. So flamethrowers, although slightly mythic in status, were not weapons that had a massive effect in the Great War, but they are still remembered today.
Artillery had a huge impact on World War I and was typical of the type of warfare used at the time. The trenches were no longer a safe place, as in 1914 the artillery could fire longer distances and had more explosive power, able to bombard the enemy all day, every day. For an infantry attack, an artillery barrage would be used as a distraction and also a way to weaken the enemy's defences and numbers. An example of this was the Battle of the Somme, where the tactic did not work due to the strength of the German defences against shell fire. However, later on, the creeping barrage was used, a tactic where the artillery would provide a protective smoke screen as the attacking infantry walked behind. This was successful. Examples of guns used in the bombardments include the British 9 howitzer, the British 18-pounder and the French 75mm field gun.
First proper use of gas, as it was considered uncivilised in previous years. It was first used by the French when, in August 1914, they deployed tear gas grenades against the Germans. However, the first serious study into chemical weapons was the Germans. In October 1914, the German army fired shells at the French which contained a chemical irritant, meant to produce a violent fit of sneezing, and 3 months later tear gas was employed. Chlorine, a poison gas, was then introduced which produced severe effects when inhaled. The Allies were outraged and the British were the first to retaliate, and this sparked common use of gas in World War I. Phosphine and mustard gas were later developed also. Gas, however, was not the most effective weapon as it depended on factors such as the wind, which could blow in any direction. But still, by the end of 1918, it seems to become widespread, and if the war had continued on to 1919, both sides had planned to insert poison gas into 30 to 50% of shells.
Tanks were first introduced in World War I and provided warfare at the time with a revolutionary piece of engineering. The first tank appeared in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September 1916. Although groundbreaking in idea and design, tanks of the Great War were very slow, not exceeding 4 miles per hour, would often break down or malfunction, or get stuck in the mud. However, tanks did increase mobility on the Western Front and played an important part in breaking the stalemate of the trenches, but still, by 1918, Britain and France had produced 6,506 tanks, with Germany only 20. The British Tank Corps had only 8 tanks left 6 days before the end of World War I. Although not as effectively used in the Great War, in evolutionary terms, tanks were one of the most successful weapons or vehicles and cemented their place in warfare and continue into the present day.
Conditions in the trenches were, for the most part, horrible, stripping men back to their very basic and most fundamental qualities, the will to survive in the muck and dirt. Many dead bodies were buried near trenches, and the toilets, called latrines, sometimes overflowed into the living areas. Millions of rats also infested the trenches, with some growing as big as household cats. Lice also tormented the men on a daily basis. In the winter especially, the conditions were terrible, with the ground turning to a dirty liquid and slush. Men drowned in the muddy waters, lying down forever. The smells were equally bad, with the rotting corpses putrefying the air, the lingering odours of poison gases and the general decay. There were many illnesses and infections in the trenches due to the terrible hygiene and conditions. Trench foot was one such infection. It is a fungal infection caused by cold, wet and unsanitary conditions. At the close of 1914, the British Army had suffered 20,000 casualties from trench foot. Common flu, colds, stomach upsets and diarrhoea spread through the men very fast due to overcrowding and such close contact all the time. All these viruses feasted on the men in the trenches as health was put on hold for the war effort. Both minor and serious infections could easily take a soldier out of action, with fevers very common on the front line.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, or otherwise known as shell shock, affected millions of men during and after the war, with many of them living with the emotional scars of battle for the rest of their lives. PTSD is a psychological trauma with symptoms ranging from uncontrollable diarrhoea to unrelenting anxiety. The terrible things these men witnessed caused muscular problems and facial tics, as well as mental damage. By the end of World War I, the army had dealt with 80,000 cases of shell shock. Tragically, PTSD was not recognised in that day, as late as 1921, as a legitimate reason or illness, with many PTSD-affected men shot for cowardice. Lots of men never recovered after encountering shell shock, being shaken to the very core, their lives never recovering, only the nightmares of battle ever standing. Rationing was introduced to Britain at the very end of World War I, after German U-boats began sinking merchant ships very frequently in the Atlantic, where most of Britain's food was imported in 1917. With unrestricted submarine warfare causing great outrage on the Allies' part and increasing America's involvement in the war, many poorer families were extremely malnourished, and with the whole population constantly hungry, the government bought over 2.5 million acres of land for farming. Groups like the Women's Land Army worked on the fields and did a very important job. Severe lack of food brought the war home for the very first time. Here is a diagram of a trench. On the top there is barbed wire, a sandbag parapet and a parados, where on the bottom you can see a 5-step and duck boards. Here is an overall view of the layout for our trenches. For example, it includes a company HQ dugout, a communications trench, and the vital no man's land. Here is an aerial shot of the Western Front, where gas is in use. This is another shot of the Western Front. Here is a diagram of the typical English soldier, complete with rucksack, shelter half roll, gas mask, and many more. Here is a German soldier who indeed is very different.
I'll stop it here.